So anyway, I want to go ahead and just get started. Got some pretty good cases for you guys. So we have two guys to choose from. You guys want to kind of maybe do this together?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I can start going for this case. So yeah, it looks like we have a punch. Overall, I'm not seeing too much going on in the dermis or the sub-Q. I can tell that there's kind of like a little bit of confluent parakeratosis, but yeah, that's like pretty much what I see from high power or low power, I mean.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot. I agree. One thing I will point out that this is subtle. I mean, if I were just looking at this blind without knowing anything myself, I would look at it and say, well, overall, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot going on there. Maybe the dermis looks a little bit weird. The septa of the fat is widened here. And normally, your septa of your fat, you can almost not even see it really. It's more kind of like this. It's just really a very, very thin strand. And so when you look at it here, it is widened. It's thickened. It's thicker than it should be. And so that's when you see that, you start kind of scratching your head and say, well, maybe there is something going on down there. And you start looking at it and you can see that there's actually some mucin here between the collagen bundles. And there's a little sparse inflammatory infiltrate here. And you guys appreciate that?
Yeah.
It's pretty subtle.
Are those lymphocytes in there?
There's some lymphocytes. There's actually a couple of plasma cells.
Okay.
And this is actually, as for this entity, this is absolutely gorgeous example of it. It just doesn't get much better than this for this process. So once you see it, and you've probably never seen this before, it'll stick in your brain a little bit. And then if you look up here, you can see also this dermis is kind of edematous.
Mm-hmm.
That's some mucin in there and a little sparse infiltrates and lymphocytes and plasma cells. So what if I told you this was, and you can see it maybe comes from acral skin or near acral skin.
Yeah, okay.
Follicles, and it's got a little thick cornified layer there. So what if I told you this was a 25-year-old woman that came to you and she was complaining that her hands were sort of thickened and she's having a little trouble making a fist now, and she didn't feel too terribly well. She wasn't really sick, but you could just tell that something was going on with her. And then if you look at this side over here, what's the shape of the biopsy here that you see here?
Yeah, so you see like a square shaped biopsy.
So you can tell that dermis is thicker than usual.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if that clue gives you any thoughts as to what.
Yeah, I guess with that kind of history and the square shaped biopsy kind of indicating maybe like some sclerosis, you could think of like morphia, or with the increased mucin, think of like scleromyxedema, kind of like things like that.
Yeah, this is a fantastic case of early inflammatory edematous puffy phase of morphia. So if you ever biopsy one of these patients when they come in, and that's exactly what they'll complain of. They'll say, my hands feel thick. I can't really, close them as well as I used to be able to. And that's kind of the early sort of manifestations. And if you do a physical exam and you sort of feel their skin and you kind of rub your hand over the area that they're complaining about, it won't move as easily over the underlying tissue as say some normal skin maybe elsewhere in their body. Because what's happening is these septa get thickened and they start tethering the skin down as opposed to letting it, kind of float freely along that subcutaneous fat and the fascial sort of margin, and it becomes thick. And that's why they feel like they can't close their hands properly. So this is what you see when you see that so-called puffy edematous stage of scleroderma. It gives you kind of a sparse infiltrate. You usually see a few plasma cells in the infiltrate. That goes along with morphia. Again, I've always challenged people like Heidi and others to sort of figure out why those plasma cells are in morphia and in patients that have sclerosing disorders like NLD or sclerodermoid GBH, whatever. Whenever you get that kind of sclerosis, you get plasma cells. And being just kind of a simple morphologist, to me, there's a clue there somewhere. And I don't know what it means, but somehow those plasma cells have got to be interacting somehow with those collagen bundles to cause the sclerosis to develop. And maybe that's, if we could target those, maybe there's a therapy there. I don't know. But we do, but this is exactly what you're supposed to see. Now, scleromyxedema, usually, interestingly enough, when you see that can give you mucin as well, but you get an increase in the number of fibroblasts there. You see kind of fibroblasts that are sort of going north, south, east, and west. If you see that at low magnification, it really almost simulates granulomannulary. And I've missed the diagnosis over the years a few times, thinking it was GA when it was scleromyxedema. So if you see what kind of looks like a weird GA or interstitial, mostly GA, you kind of always have to think of scleromyxedema, and then, make sure that they don't have an underlying paraproteinemia. But this is I mean, you wouldn't call this a classic, morphia at with an obvious sclerotic stage, late stage, where the person's skin feels like, shoe leather. Here, it's going to be more kind of the edematous stage, more kind of where they feel like their skin is puffy. So this is remember, this is what it looks like when you get an early stage. And you don't really learn about these kind of things if you just read a textbook. They don't really emphasize the fact that there are plasma cells in these sclerosing disorders. They don't really talk about this stage of morphia. If you ever write a chapter for a textbook, you're ever asked to do that, they give you a certain number of pages, and you're kind of limited to that length of space. And so everybody covers the obvious stuff, but this is something that you kind of need to know, because this is when you can still make the diagnosis here, and you can intervene here earlier than when it gets to that late sort of thickened sclerotic phase.
Hey, Dr. Cockerell, if this was like a patient with systemic sclerosis, would the biopsy look exactly the same even if it was early?
Yeah, good question. The answer is yes. These sclerosing disorders, and when I was resident and fellow back in New York with Dr. Ackerman, he would talk about the family of sclerosing disorders. And I agree with him. I think that these all kind of look the same under the microscope. Now, I've never seen a very super early sclerodermoid form of, sclerodermoid PCT or sclerodermoid GVHD. And I don't know if they necessarily go through these same stages. They might, but they might be kind of more accelerated, if you will. But yeah, if you look at progressive systemic sclerosis, if you get somebody if somebody comes in, their hands are puffy early on, you're not sure whether they've got morphia, if it's atherosclerosis, if they might have crest or whatever, they can all look the same. So you're kind of obligated to make sure they don't have systemic disease when you kind of catch it at an early stage like this. So good question. All right, here's another one. This is a kind of a cool case, kind of a rare entity that we don't see too terribly frequently.
Okay. Well, it looks like the main action here is in sort of this, the dermis. There's this, what I would call like almost nodular looking, I think that's more of like a proliferation, from what I can see at least.
Okay, so you're basically, your instant sort of reflex arc is, this looks like a neoplasm. It certainly doesn't look like just purely an inflammatory disorder.
I don't think so.
Good. Good. We're gonna convert that "don't think so" to a definitive. It's absolutely no chance it's inflammatory, Dr. Cockerell. You're full of crap if you think it's inflammatory.
There we go. Yes. A lot of these bluish cells. So I think there may be some paler areas as well.
Good. So you're thinking epithelial?
Yes.
Okay, so epithelial, benign or malignant based on this?
It looks small and relatively like well circumcised. There's a very clear skin, so I would lean more towards.
I completely agree with you. So we look at it, we can try to, it's multiple nodular aggregations here, but we look at the overall lesion and say, hey, this thing kind of stops right here. It's not extending to both edges. There's no single cells sitting down here. It's not trying to get in nerves, anything like that. It looks pretty well contained. So it's a relatively small, largely symmetrical neoplasm with basaloid, basophilic morphology. So when you see kind of a basaloid morphology to the cells, what do you do? What's the next step in the algorithm that you do?
Makes me like wonder what type of differentiation, like is it This almost looks like follicular to me.
Good, good, good. So yeah, follicular. So if it looks basophilic, epithelial, you say probably follicular, but there's a couple of other things it could be, but the most common, your first gut reaction, your first reflex is going to be follicular. And so then you're going to look at it and see if you can see if there's anything that kind of talks you out of that, if you will. So let's go to higher magnification and see if we see things that kind of look like follicular differentiation possibly here. So what do you think at this power?
I still think so.
Yeah, it's kind of primitive though, isn't it? You know, if it doesn't
very
look
early.
like if it's a follicle, which part of the follicle do you think it's recapitulating here?
I think more like isthmus, sort of, like not as.
Yeah, or maybe like the mantle zone, you know, that little stem cell population likes to live in that isthmic area. You know, it's
lowest part of the follicle, basically.
Yeah, either the inferior portion where you've got the area, the cells that are making the actual hair shaft, or you're talking about that little isthmic area, which is, you know, and people used to argue about that all the time. You know, Dr. Ackerman actually didn't believe in that mantle, that little thing for a long time. I think he finally kind of did, but there's a stem cell population that lives there. And so when that hair follicle cycles, he used to say that there were little residual stem cells from the inferior portion of the follicle that were kind of traveling up and down, but we now know they live in that mantle zone. And if you destroy the mantle zone, like in lichen planopilaris, they get permanent alopecia. You don't have to touch the base of the follicle for that. You can wipe out that isthmic area and their hairs are gone forever. So this is probably living in that little zone and it's producing these little small primordial follicular-like structures, if you will. They don't look like classic hair follicles, but that sort of looks like a papillary mesenchymal body a little bit. It's not perfect for it.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, that word. I was like papillary mesenchymal body almost, but not quite there.
Yeah, good. I agree with you. I think it's kind of primordial, probably coming from the follicle. Now, there's one other item here that's unusual about this lesion. What else do you see here that's not? So in other words, if you're thinking like a follicular neoplasm, like a trichoepithelioma or trichofolliculoma or fibrofolliculoma, something like that, is there anything about this specific lesion we're looking at right here in this field that would not be seen in those entities?
I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but it almost looks like there's like sebocyte looking cells, like, or like there's these kind of more like bubbly cells.
There's some clear cells in here. And, you know, the differential diagnosis when you're looking at a clear cell in a lesion that's got a basaloid morphology is going to be either a sebocyte, like you said, or it's going to be maybe the outer root sheath, tricholimal differentiation.
Oh, right.
White. So in other words, this can either be lipid or glycogen. And, you know, usually if you look at the nucleus of a sebocyte, and maybe that's a sebocyte, that might be as well. So there may be some of those, but others look like they're just kind of centrally placed with no real gossamer strands of nucleoplasm radiating to the outer part of the cell. That's kind of, if you look at the nucleus of a sebocyte, basically, it kind of looks like a star, if you will. So if you go back and look at those, so these don't look quite like that. So they're probably tricholimal. So this is glycogen. But what else do you see here that's kind of unusual? What about these little cells over here?
Are those inflammatories like lymphocytes?
They are. They're lymphocytes, and they're notice that they're not just between the aggregations. Some of them are actually in the aggregations themselves. Yeah. In fact, there are a lot of them that are inside the aggregation.
Yeah, that's weird.
It is weird. So, and you may not have heard of this entity before, but there is a benign epithelial neoplasm that's thought to be follicular. It's sort of, people have debated as to whether it's follicular or maybe some people have argued it might be sweat gland origin. I think it's most likely follicular because of some of the stuff we're seeing here. But they have lymphocytes within the actual basaloid aggregations, which you don't usually see like in a basal cell carcinoma or like in a trichoep or any of those kind of things. So does anybody know what this entity is? So if you don't know, you're going to be way ahead of a lot of your colleagues around the United States because they may not have even ever heard of this thing.
I am not sure.
It's called a lymphadenoma. Lymphadenoma is the name for this. And, there's a lot of, if you go back and look at the literature, Ron Barr and others from California wrote about this a long time ago. And Ron's a good friend. And he actually also wrote about the concept of dermal thymus. And he was thinking that somehow these are sort of analogous to little epithelial rests that are sort of somewhat similar to the thymus, Hassel's corpuscles. And occasionally you'll see little squamoid pearls within these lesions, but he's thinking this is sort of in the family of maybe thymus because it's got all these lymphocytes in here. And I believe, I hadn't really looked at this in a while, but I think these are T cells primarily in here. So this is a lymphadenoma. So it's another entity that's in the family of basaloid follicular hamartomatous lesions. So if you ever see one that kind of looks like a weird cross between a funny maybe tricho and maybe a trichoblastoma, but it's got lymphocytes within it and clear staining cells like you see here, think of lymphadenoma. Just think of that. So you at least know what it is. And it's benign. You don't have to worry about these. They're not going to metastasize. The patients aren't going to die from it. Here's a nice example of a contrast between a sebaceous cell. You see that nucleus right there? And this is probably a tricholemal cell right there that's got clear cytoplasm. That's a nice way to contrast these things cytologically. It's always good when you can do that and say, here's normal. Look at all the bubbles in there. And then this thing looks kind of like a little star and it's hyperchromatic. And these nuclei are dying here because they're, undergoing holocrine secretion, whereas these cells are not dying. They're actively metabolically active with ATP and they've got glycogen here. So it's a different type of cell altogether. So that's a good example of that. Did anybody, have you ever heard of that before? You haven't, go back and read about it. It's kind of an interesting concept. Just to kind of know about. Okay, it's a good one too. We got some subtle stuff in here today. Anybody want to give this one a go?
This one's a punch biopsy here, and it looks really busy. There's a lot going on in the epidermis and the dermis.
Oh, epidermis or dermis mostly?
Well, most of the inflammation is in the dermis, but I noticed that
Good.
epidermis.
You said the word quote busy, and a lot of people use that term. Some cliches kind of cause an emetic reaction, and others you sort of allow in, if you will. When I first heard that, I sort of didn't like it, but a lot of people are using it now, and it makes sense. So when you say busy dermis, that basically is a reflex arc. It's sort of, subtentorial a little bit. What do you mean when you say busy dermis? What does that mean to you?
Well, for busy dermis, it means that there's just a lot of inflammation going on throughout or there's a lot just going on throughout the entire dermis, both superficial and deep.
So, and what really sort of what most people mean when they say that, so if they were say a busy dermis just means there's a lot of stuff, quote unquote, going on in the dermis, that can be a lot of things. So in other words, if you had what if you had like a widespread diffuse metastatic malignant melanoma, you had a large solid mass of neoplastic cells in there, that really wouldn't be the so-called busy dermis differential that my colleagues like to talk about. They basically are referring to kind of an interstitial mostly, or perivascular and interstitial, where you've got a diffuse interstitial. You just picture cells are kind of, bleeding between the collagen bundles diffusely in the dermis. That's what they mean when they say busy dermis. So and that's why I like the concept that means interstitial mostly pattern, which has a short differential. So we love it when there's a short differential, because it basically means that we don't have to go through a gazillion things. We go through a relatively limited number of things. And so you said inflammation. Now, if you have this so-called busy dermis differential, what can cause that? What are some of the things that can give you this interstitial mostly pattern at low magnification? So when you go to higher magnification, you're going to hone in on that. So that's the reason I'm not going to high magnification yet, because I'm going to make you give me a couple of thoughts So when you go to high magnification, you'll be doing it in a targeted fashion.
Right. I guess what you can think about with a busy dermis is an infectious etiology.
You could. So in other words, think about, inflammatory or neoplastic, that's probably the most general common things. So if it's going to be inflammatory, say, well, it could be an infectious disease. Okay, which infectious disease really likes to give you an interstitial mostly pattern? There's really not too many of them, actually.
Would syphilis give you an interstitial pattern?
Syphilis can do anything. So if you want to get the right answer, always say syphilis. If you want to get the right, if you love being right versus just learning, always say syphilis and drug. You'll always be right. And if you ask Jack Cohen, he says always put, Hansen's in there too. But syphilis can do anything. But that's probably one of the least common patterns that syphilis could do. That's actually not the most likely disease that gives you an interstitial mostly infectious disease that can give you an interstitial mostly pattern. There's really actually just a few of them that can do it.
I guess
you may not know, and that's okay if you don't too, by the way.
I was initially thinking like viral as well, but I think that's less likely with how deep the inflammation is here.
Yeah, viral is usually kind of a sparse superficial perivascular dermatitis, or to get the DNA viruses and whatnot, they start involving the epidermis with the multinucleated giant cells with herpes, et cetera, the vacuolar alteration. But cellulitis and erysipelas, like we mentioned in the grand rounds last week, that gives you an interstitial mostly infiltrate with neutrophils, sort of phlegmonous type inflammation. So that's relatively rare infectious. But what are some non-infectious interstitial mostly busy dermis things that you can see?
Some of the things that we mentioned earlier today, like interstitial GA, scleromyxedema.
Perfect. Good. Those are two right there. Excellent. Where you got histiocytes and fibroblasts diffusely in the dermis. So we got neutrophils and cellulitis. You got histiocytes and fibroblasts in those conditions. I might even toss in nephrogenic systemic fibrosis. That can give you interstitial histiocyte fibroblasts in there as well. So remember that one. What else can do it? What about neoplasms?
Right. Like Kaposi sarcoma.
Yes, Kaposi sarcoma can do it. Absolutely. Now there's three, well, there's probably about 5 or 6 subtypes of KS histologically, but which one of the subtypes gives you an interstitial mostly pattern?
I'm not sure exactly.
Okay. Anybody know? What are the 3 main subtypes of KS that we see?
Do you mean like classic
Well, histologically, because the classic and the HIV related, they both look the same under the microscope. So what are the 3 main stages of KS that we see when we look at it under the microscope?
Like patch?
Yes. Patch. What's next?
Plaque and tumor?
Yeah. Patch, plaque, nodule. Exactly. There's also angiomatous. There's a lymphangiomatous type, et cetera. But those are the 3 main types that you need to know. Patch, plaque, nodular stage KS. So which of those gives you the interstitial mostly pattern?
Would it be more patch?
Yeah, patch and plaque. Yeah, exactly. And what they do is they start off around the pre-existing blood vessels, and you get these newly formed blood vessels surrounding the pre-existing blood vessels. That's called the promontory sign. And then the cells they're diffusely present between and among the collagen bundles all through the dermis. So you talk about this busy dermis. If you do electron microscopy, and years ago when I was a resident back in the 1980s, they did electron microscopy of early KS lesions. They're trying to figure out what was going on with HIV. They were so perplexed at what this disease was going on. They did EM, and they could find all these cells between all these collagen bundles, and you can see it with electron microscopy. So all of these little cells here are endothelial cells that we're looking at here. And this is a beautiful example of the plaque stage of Kaposi sarcoma here. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the main thing is, I don't really care if you could identify this as, KS here. I mainly just want you to go through that differential of that so-called busy dermis, so you'll think about it. What are a couple of other neoplasms that can give you an interstitial mostly pattern?
I guess you don't want to miss like a desmoplastic melanoma. I guess blue knee.
Idea, yeah, that's a possibility. I'll go along with that. But what's another more traditional interstitial, mostly neoplasm that we think of when you get the neoplastic cells are just dissecting diffusely between and among the collagen bundles?
Like a malignancy, like a MET?
Yeah, exactly. Which type of MET? What's the most common?
Breast cancer?
Yes, breast cancer. The so-called Indian filing that we used to talk about in the old days. Yeah, that's where you get the single cells are present diffusely between and among the collagen bundles. So that's really common with metastatic ductal breast carcinoma, classic. Now there's several other types of breast CA. You don't need to become a breast pathologist, but that's one that you do need to know because that is the one that gives you the classic pattern of the so-called busy dermis with neoplastic cells. And then the other one that really can give you that pattern fairly commonly is leukemia. So, leukemia can give you an interstitial, mostly dermal pattern. So just remember that differential and make sure then you go down, you look at the higher magnification, you start looking to see what's going on. So you say, well, hey, these are not obviously large round epithelial cells of breast cancer. They're not lymphocytes. It's not leukemia. Here we've got a blood vessel. Looks like it's got a little tuft of blood vessels surrounding some pre-existing blood vessel. So that's kind of a promontory sign right there. So this is Kaposi sarcoma here. Here's another example. See, that's a pre-existing blood vessel. That's a normal blood vessel. And all of these jagged, irregular vascular spaces surrounding it, that's what they call the promontory sign. So that's a classic finding that you see in relatively early patch or plaque lesions of KS. You don't see, this isn't nodular KS, which is a solid nodular aggregation of those neoplastic cells. And it looks like a solid spindle cell tumor. This is more of a diffuse pattern. So just make sure you remember that. Okay, great. Good job. Must be frustrating. I didn't let you go to high magnification. This time you do get to go to high magnification. So who wants to give this one a go?
I can go again. Okay, so we're looking at, it looks like a punch that got kind of like fragmented here. I think.
I bet it was more of a shave.
A deep shave, yeah.
And I think this thing was probably an exophytic lesion.
Yeah.
You can see it's kind of got the crusting and verrucous, and so they probably thought it was a cancer. My bet.
That makes sense. There's really like dense infiltrate in the dermis.
Good.
Like a lot of lymphocytes, but probably kind of mixed from here.
Good. What about over here?
It looks maybe a little more histiocytic right there.
Good. And do you think everything is, so we know there's histiocytes in here, and some of these are lymphocytes. Others look a little bit more kind of salt and pepperish at low power. Again, they're not quite as jet black. So when we think of that, we say, well, maybe they're going to be polys. So if we see histiocytes, some polys, and what about this epidermis here?
It looks like there's just like hyperplasia.
Good. What do you call that kind of hyperplasia?
I was just trying to think of the word. It's like what you see in like a lot of infectious disease, like
pseudocarcinomatous hyperplasia or pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia. And you're exactly right. That's a clue that you might be dealing with an infectious process. So we see this pattern of low magnification, and that's the value of low power. That's why I really want you guys to get at least pretty good at that, because when you're going to board examination and you're looking at these, the goal is to hone in on the diagnosis pretty quickly, so you can, you don't want to be lost at sea when you're looking at something like this. You want to say, okay, this pattern looks like, suppurative granulomatous with pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia. I'm going to think infectious right away. And then you go to my higher magnification, maybe you change your mind, but that should be the first thing you think about when you see this. And hopefully you can get where you can do that in a matter of, 10, 15 seconds, where it happens pretty quickly. So let's go to higher magnification. And we've got obvious histiocytes right here. And now what do we see? Sometimes this is a board type question, by the way. So if they're going to show you something like this, they're going to put something in there that you don't have to spend 10 minutes going on a bug hunt. It's going to be right there, and they're going to expect you to be able to see it and recognize it. It's going to be fair.
Yeah, so I think I see these like two kind of refractal spherules here.
Good. So what's the diagnosis?
Would this be cocci?
This is cocci. Good. It's coccydermatopathology. It's pretty obvious. Beautiful example of it. So now, most likely on something like this, because it's such a beautiful example, they would probably show it to you as a slide. They might show you a Kodachrome of something like that. And we say Kodachrome, they're not Kodachromes today, but that's basically what they used to call them in my day. They might show you a digital image of this and then start asking some secondary questions. They might say the most likely diagnosis is, and you'd say, cocci, but they might throw in there, what's the classic differential they put in there for spherules?
I mean, what you mean, like other types of fungi?
Yeah, what's the only other organism that we see in dermatology and dermatopathology that gives you spherules in the skin like this? They're not this big, but they give you spherules.
Is it it's not like chromo, I'm trying to think of the other one that's like the same size.
It occurs in the nose area most commonly. That's why it's called the name. Anybody remember it?
Yeah, anyone can say it if they can think of it.
Nobody remembers? Rhinosporidiosis, Rhinosporidium seaberi. And it's not really a fungus. It's actually kind of a parasite. It lives in a different little kind of area of the phylogenetic tree than cocci, but it gives you spherules. And it's almost kind of like alien. When you look at one of those things, each one of those little tiny little structures inside there can lead to another spherule. And if you see a biopsy of one of those, you'll usually see just, hundreds of spherules in there with the little small mini organisms inside the spherule. And it's a bigger organism, way, way bigger than this. The individual small mini organisms are, they're probably a little bit smaller than this, but they're much larger than the tiny little spores of cocci that we see inside the endospores of coccidioidomycosis. So they might ask you, okay, where's this patient most likely hail from? Are they coming from the Northeast? Are they coming from Chicago? Where's these patients like to live?
For cocci, it would be
cocci.
like southwestern.
Yeah, the lower Sonoran life zone area. So a little bit further west of here, down in Mexico, Arizona. So that's where we see cocci. And this biopsy came from our laboratory. We occasionally get patients that have cocci. They move here from those areas, or maybe they've been there and they move back here, and then they get immunocompromised with diabetes or something, and then they pop up with cocci. So the other thing about cocci, sometimes I don't see it here, but we had a case a few years ago where we actually had the barrel-shaped arthrospores that were present in the cornified layer. So that's what you see with cocci when the lesions undergo, when they kind of vegetate and grow and culture, they form these arthrospores that can be aerosolized. So it's kind of dangerous to grow cocci in culture because of that. But that's a good example. So main teaching point there, make sure you recognize that pattern of that suppurative granulomatous inflammation. The best place to look for the bugs is within the histiocytes and also in abscesses. Okay, this one's a little bit out of focus. I apologize for that, but I think it's diagnostic.
Okay, I can go again. So this looks like I don't know if it's something that's shelled out, but the epidermis is all the way around it.
Yeah, what do you think the lesion looked like clinically?
Like almost like a marble, like.
Yeah, or maybe like a skin tag. It might have been a little pedunculated papule. They probably snipped it off or shaved it off and sent it in. And maybe they thought it was a skin tag. And that's actually when we see patients have this. This is super bad imaging here. I can't, it's fuzzy. I guess if you can diagnose something out of focus, and you're really good dermatologist.
I don't know, the skin tag type lesions. I guess the other things that I've gotten back on biopsies have been like nevus lipomatosis superficialis or like weird neurofibroma, but I don't think it was a neurofibroma.
No, good. You're right. Yeah, those are things that can look like a skin tag. And so, but there's probably about 50 things that can look like a skin tag. But so as we look at this lesion itself, the overall architecture, low power, looks like a skin tag, but there's something else going on here, isn't there? There's an epithelial component within it.
Yeah, right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
It's
So when
almost
we
like
look at
stranded
this,
too.
yes, good. Now we had the lymphadenoma earlier.
Yeah.
What do we see here? We got a little, so this is epithelial and non-epithelial here, right? We've got what looks like a skin tag that's got all this fibrous tissue, right? And then we've got this epithelial component here. Now, what part of the epithelium is this recapitulating here?
That looks more infundibular, like there's like,
That part looks like an infundibulum.
yeah, right there. Mhm.
And then we got these, which
That
are,
looks, I don't know if that's cystic.
yeah, it's out of focus, but these are sebaceous glands. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you've got these little sort of small strands of cells here that are kind of forming this little kind of intercalated network. And then we've got this prominent stroma that's associated with this part of the hair follicle. So what part of the follicles, remember, we really have three main parts, but you have to really think there's actually a fourth part. And this is that part that lives in that isthmus zone right there. What do we call that part? That's sort of the forgotten part, but it actually is important when we're dealing with these annexal neoplasms.
I'm not sure.
That's the mantle zone.
Mantle
So that's
zone.
kind of the
So that's what
mantle
you were
zone.
talking about before too.
Exactly. So here it is again. Here it is again. Now this one's not forming a basaloid area, right? This is forming what looks like these maybe little, this is sort of like trying to form a little mini follicle. It's got, you know, so with the mantle zone area, you get, that's where the apocrine glands come off of. That's where the sebaceous glands get formed. So that these are little stem cells that can give rise to the inferior portion of the follicle. So when you get a tumor that forms there and it's got these little fibrous areas around it, and you've got these little primitive follicles here, any idea what this whole entity is called? And you may not know it, but this is a pretty good example of it here.
Like fibrofolliculoma.
Yeah, good. This is an example of a fibrofolliculoma. It's kind of an interesting variant of it because it's got the little sebaceous elements, but basically this is like a little hamartoma of the mantle zone that gives you, there's some that look a little different than this, but it actually can give you sometimes just a little single strand of the epithelium with the fibrous tissue surrounding it. And so when you see a fibrofolliculoma, what do you think about immediately in that situation?
Burr-Hogg-Dubé.
Yes, Burr-Hogg-Dubé. So that's another board question 101. You know you're going to get asked that. You know you're going to ask about Cowden's. You know you're going to get asked about, you know, Muratori. So you may as well just go ahead and commit those tumors to memory. And you know the various entities can be associated with this. This was a pretty easy one, but they get, you know, fibrofolliculomas, trichodiscoma. Now they think it's thought that this basically this neoplasm that again lives in the mantle zone, in cats in the mantle zone, they get Merkel cells, and they get a touch receptor that kind of gets developed there, and that's also a mantle zone process. And so when you see the trichodisc, which means like a little fibrous sort of structure that's associated with a hair follicle that's associated with detecting vibration, that's mostly fibrous tissue. And then if you see fibrofolliculoma or perifollicular fibroma, you see a small little strand of the follicle like this, coupled with this prominent fibrous stroma that you see there. So those are the three lesions that are associated with Burr-Hogg-Dubé. They're probably really all just variants of the same thing. So that's, you know, don't, you know, get too concerned about that. But the main thing is recognizing fibrofolliculoma, perifollicular fibroma that's associated with Burr-Hogg-Dubé, autosomal dominant, pneumothorax, renal cell carcinoma, multiple skin lesions on their face, trunk, less commonly, but mostly head and neck area. That's Burr-Hogg-Dubé. So just make sure you know that one. which sounds like you guys do know it pretty well. So that's good. Okay, we got time probably for this, maybe one more. Anybody want to give this one a go?
So this is a superficial to mid-dermal infiltrate.
Good.
There's lighter and more cellular areas. There's likely a grin zone.
Good. Excellent. What's the pattern, if you will, here?
It's interstitial.
Is it purely, it's not like that busy dermal thing we saw, right? It's different than that.
Maybe perivascular interstitial.
Yeah, and it's kind of almost forming nodules, right? Like this is sort of a nodule of inflammation, and here you got multiple nodules kind of coalesce. So it's kind of nodular and diffuse, if you can see that. It's kind of like everything from here and here is involved. Now it doesn't involve down here, but it's pretty nodular and diffuse, at least in the upper part of the specimen. And you're right, there's a grin zone. There's a grin zone. And what kind of cells are these?
So there's lymphocytes, histiocytes, and there's a lot of eosinophils.
Good. I'm sure you probably appreciate that when you're higher magnification. So when you see that pattern with that kind of mixed infiltrate, with the grin zone like this over kind of a broad front, what kind of things, and what part of the body are you on here, by the way?
If there's hair follicle, sebaceous glands, and maybe head and neck.
Yeah, good. Maybe head, certainly, I think I would favor head and neck. There's also some sun damage. So this guy's been out in the sun. So what's your differential diagnosis here?
So I'm thinking granuloma faciale.
Okay.
Or the other thing is like lymphoid hyperplasia or the eosinophilia.
Okay.
Or like
Anything else you'd throw in there?
It's hard for me to tell, but like the histiocytic things, I was thinking like LCH, but I mean, there's no, epidermal component. So
Yeah, does LCH usually give you a grin zone?
no, it shouldn't.
Yeah, it's epidermotropic. So that'd be an anti LCH thing. What's this stuff here that I'm pointing out? It may be difficult to see, but this is a clue to this diagnosis also. These little structures right here. And it's hard to see, but that's leukocytoclasia.
Uh-huh.
There's leukocytoclasia here. So what do you think about when you hear of leukocytoclasia?
Like small vessel vasculitis.
Or just vasculitis? It can be large vessel vasculitis too, right?
Sure.
So
Right.
leukocytoclasia means immune complex mediated stuff. So how do you reconcile leukocytoclasia, nodular infiltrate with lymphocytes, neutrophils, and eosinophils, grin zone on the face area? You said granuloma faciale, but what's the business with the leukocytoclasia?
So erythema elevatum diadenum, I think.
Well, EED is, but can you see leukocytoclasia and granuloma faciale?
I think you can.
You sure can. Exactly. And some people, so what this disease is thought to be is possibly some kind of a chronic, long-standing vasculitis that ultimately leads to a nodular dermatitis like this. That's what's thought to be. So if you see that, that's a very good clue that that's what you're dealing with. And if you take the same thing and transport it to somebody's hand, then it's no longer granuloma faciale, then it's EED. Because basically it's kind of a histologic identical twin. Now, sometimes in EED, you'll see cholesterol clefts. If you leave that disease alone long enough, you get fibrosis and perivascular fibrotic onion skin-like changes there. But this is a beautiful example of EED, or I'm sorry, of granuloma faciale. Now, if you said angiolymphoid hyperplasia, so let's say you're getting ready to answer your question here, it's multiple choice, you look down there, and lo and behold, that's listed. What happens then? How are you going to tell those two apart?
I think there'd be like more of a lymphoid component in the angiolymphoid with hyperplasia.
Do you see do you see neutrophils and leukocytoclasia and angiolymphoid hyperplasia?
You know.
No, you do not. What's the main problem with angiolymphoid hyperplasia? What's the fundamental element of that lesion that you have to have, or it can't be that?
Like
sometimes
a vascular
have no
perforation.
eosinophil. I'm sorry?
Like a vascular perforation.
The blood vessels, good. They have to be large, thick wall blood vessels with prominent endothelial cells that protrude into the lumen. If you don't see that, you can have that with few eosinophils, interestingly enough. Sometimes the eosinophilia of that is a circulating eosinophilia. You don't get that many in the tissue sometimes. But if you don't have the blood vessels, you don't get that diagnosis. So here we don't have the blood vessels. We have relatively small blood vessels that have inflammation surrounding it. And we have the Grin zone, we have the mixed infiltrates. So again, you would not want to choose that as a choice if you see this pattern. Okay, so we'll show you an example of angular lymphoid hyperplasia to compare. These are not the thick walled blood vessels here. You got some prominent endothelial cells, but they're not markedly thick walled, and you really need the thick walled blood vessels to have that, or you don't get it. And it wouldn't have the rest of this inflammatory pattern anyway, so that's good. So major teaching points about this: diffuse infiltrate, nodular infiltrate, mixed infiltrate, neutrophils, vasculitis sometimes with some leukocytoclasia, and the Grin zone. And it looks identical to EED, but it's on the head and neck area on the face. Okay, great. So that's it. Thank you guys for tuning in. And we will do this again next month. Any questions or anything about anything we talked about? Okay, you guys have a good day.